Okay, we're recording.
All right, thanks. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. If you are just entering the Zoom, please introduce yourself in the chat box and share your name, pronouns, if you're with an organization and where you're based. Again, your name, pronouns, if you're with an organization and where you are based. And if you could please keep yourself muted when you're not speaking, that would help us with minimizing any background noise. And again, thanks for joining us for our second communications webinar for community partners. Asian Americans Advancing Justice AAJC is excited to host this new webinar series focused on strategic communications, best practices, and ways to use press, social media, and communications tools to advance your work. Next slide, please. As you may know, we kicked off this new training series with our inaugural webinar on Media Training 101, What You Need to Know, earlier this month. And during our second webinar today, we'll be focusing on getting ready for your close-up. And this webinar will focus on the preparation you need to do for an interview with the press, from how to appear in front of the camera or virtual interviews to how to craft key talking points in the perfect soundbite. And you'll also learn how to respond to tough questions and stay on message. And you'll get to practice putting all of these new skills into action during breakout groups today. And we are joined by an incredible team of 4 speakers today. And from Asian Americans Advancing Justice AAJC, we have Michelle Boykins, our Senior Director of Strategic Communications, and Mary Tablante, our Digital Strategies Manager. And from the Raven Group, we have Daniel Herrera, who is the director at the Raven Group, and Michael Tora, who is a managing principal at the Raven Group. Next slide, please. Today's webinar and this 3-part communications training series is made possible with the support of our sponsor, Charter Communications, a leading broadband connectivity company and cable operator serving more than 30 million customers in 41 states through its Spectrum brand. And Advancing Justice AAJC is proud to serve on Charter's External Diversity and Inclusion Council and work in partnership with Charter to empower and advance local communities, including the Asian and Asian American community. Next slide. We have 4 goals today. Understand how to control an interview, create a soundbite and talking points, learn journalist tricks of the trade, and interactive interview practice. If you have questions during the presentations, please ask your questions in the chat box or the questions box, and we'll have time reserved at the very end for Q&A too. This webinar is recorded, and we will send out a copy of the recording and a copy of the presentation after the webinar. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Michelle Boykins.
So much, Bessie. And there are some people who are still coming in. So please, if you've just joined us, please make sure to mute yourself and also introduce yourself in the chat as everyone else is doing. We're so happy to have you here this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. So today is really about helping you to gain the confidence with your interviewing skills, being able to take that interview when opportunity knocks and really basically knock it out the park. I'm a baseball enthusiast, so pardon the use of the analogy. So what we really want to do here is to help you be able to draft talking points, to be able to stay on message, and to be able to deliver a confident interview. And lastly, we want you to be able to remember a few key takeaways in this presentation that will really help you build the foundation for the interviewing that you may have to do. So if you take anything else away from this, we certainly hope that you take away these 3 key points that help you understand and have a guide for how you're going to craft your messaging and how you're going to deliver your content during an interview. So bear with me, I'm also letting people in. There's still some more folks coming in. So for those of you who were with us last time in the first webinar, this slide will look familiar to you. And basically, I wanted to bring the slide back because it's an opportunity to remind everyone of why you're doing this. We talk about the media and the fact that the media can really be a resource for you, can be a tool in your work, just as your newsletter is, just as your social media channels are, as your website is. And if you do that and you work with them in a confident and in a way that they understand, you know what they need, and you're also able to get what you need, it's really a good relationship that you can build, and one that you can use to help people understand what actions you may want them to take, understand more about your issue or about your organization, to be able to be introduced to a whole new set of people who may not even know about your issue, may not know why they should care about your issue, and may not know about your organization. So this gives you an opportunity to really allow your organization, your issue, and give an awareness to what you're talking about to an audience that either you want to make sure you get in front of, or to an audience that would not have otherwise been known to you or touched your issue in any way. Someone is coming in right now. All right, so let's talk about how you get into confidence in your delivery. So the first of these 3 C's, we have an example, and this example is one where you'll see the person who's being interviewed doesn't really give in to some of the interviewer's tricks, and you'll see what I'm talking about in a minute. But the key here in this piece, along with a few other things that we'll talk about after you see it, is that she remains really confident in her delivery of her points. Even when someone tries to trip her up, she makes sure that she's confident in what her message is and how she delivers it.
Okay, different issue around labeling. I think everybody gets that, and I think the trend in society now is more transparency, and you're going to get labeled. Fine, okay. But I'm trying to explore whether you have any flexibility in your thinking about the merits of science and food. It doesn't sound like you do, and I find that not good, actually.
Actually, you know what? If they want to experiment, okay, but that brings me back to the labeling. At least give us the choice.
The truth is, though, as we know, virtually every product in the grocery store would then be labeled GMO. One danger that you'd face is we would just become immune to that label. We would accept that it's everywhere. As Kevin says, we've been exposed to it for decades, and we shrug and say, well, it may be killing the monarch butterflies, but, you know, I've been eating it for 10 years, so I'm not going to stop now. Are you worried about that aspect of this?
Not necessarily, because at least then they have the choice if they want to eat it. But the people like me will find the
I don't really. I mean, I don't have a choice to avoid GMO corn if I live in America, right? Because it is all genetically modified.
It's pretty much all.
So if I'm going to eat corn or any corn-based products or any corn flour or anything that's derived from it, I'm eating this stuff. So that's a pretty tough choice to make.
I mean, there are the odd ones that aren't, and that's why we do want labeling. That way we do know which ones are.
You know, you're very articulate. That's a positive. What I'm concerned about and wanting more with you is whether you become a shill for a group that wants to use you because you're young, you're articulate, you're getting lots of media, and I'm happy for you on that. But I'm trying to figure out whether you really deep down believe this, that you should stop all scientific approach to looking at food, even if it has long-term benefits down the road for people that really are not as lucky as we are in North America, that don't have access to all the protein we do. That can't be your position. I don't believe it.
It's not necessarily that, and this brings me again back to the labeling, because I mean, at least test it properly, adequately. That way we know as the consumer if it's safe. And you know what? Okay, whoever wants to eat it or whoever wants to experiment with it, go ahead.
Okay, different issues.
So basically, you'll see that here's a young woman. She very clearly articulated her position, and even though she didn't necessarily have the best responses to all of their questions, she was an interviewee who was sticking to her talking points. And in front of argumentative interviewers, in front of interviewers who were pushing her, she still stuck to those key goals. And so no matter what they tried to do, she was able to make sure that she got her message out there and stayed on course. And that's something that you'll be able to practice later on when we break out into different breakout groups. But it's important to remember that you may have an interviewer who's going to try to take you off course, but your job is to stick to your key talking points, to come back to them often. And you'll see that she wasn't necessarily prepared for all of the hard questions that she received, but she was able to remember, go right back to her talking points, go right back to what her main messages were. She wanted to talk about testing. She wanted to make sure that she talked about having choice. So those were things that were very clear in, in what she was saying. And so when you think about how you're going to craft what you do in terms of messaging, you want to make sure that you kind of hone in on those 2 or 3 things that no matter what, that you are going to leave that interview having said. And you also want to think about, how do you fit in? So in this case, she was actually a unique spokesperson. So she wasn't just a spokesperson on this. She was someone who brought a unique perspective as a young advocate, as a youth advocate. So not your typical organizational spokesperson. And that probably played a lot to her advantage in the majority of interviews, because she likely wasn't going to get as many of the hard questions, but clearly in this interview, she did. And she was still able to deliver on that message and be a credible spokesperson for the issue. And again, I want to remind everyone, if you can, please put yourself on mute so we can reduce the background noise. Thank you. Now, this next clip, I'll share it, and then we'll have a chance to be able to, to kind of dissect it together.
There are no fewer than 20 events in D.C. Protests, marches, walkouts, strikes, other things. And a lot of it is converging here at Freedom Plaza. I'm with Trinice McDowell. She's one of the leaders of the Black Women's March. Trinice, tell me, what was the main message that you wanted to come to Freedom Plaza to put forth? Again, you guys marched from across town. What did you want to say?
So we're here to remind folks that as long as prisons exist, then Black death will continue. We especially have to defend Black women march here today to remind folks about the death that is consistent in our communities. State-sanctioned violence is not the only violence that is killing Black women, girls, and gender non-conforming folks. It is patriarchy. And patriarchy that rule white supremacy. We're here to remind people to abolish the police, to defund MPD, to take police out of schools, and to really move towards abolition as a politic that keep all people safe and keep all people free.
All right, and Paris Thatcher is another leader of this march. Paris, Juneteenth does it take on your meeting here? Is there a message do you think should be put forward here?
I think what's really important is to understand that Juneteenth has been celebrated in this country by Black folks for over 150 years. And today we have this reinvigoration around it because we know that Black folks are still fighting. We're still fighting for our liberation and our freedom, in particular Black women, queer folks, and trans folks. So today we are rallying to defund the police, to defend Black women, and that Juneteenth is essential to Black joy and liberation.
Thank you, ladies, very much. Good luck. A lot of passion here with these 2 young ladies and with hundreds of people here. There are no fewer than...
All right, so in this clip, you had 2 people who clearly had their talking points together. They knew exactly what they wanted to say if they were put on camera, and they both were able to get through their talking points. The difference is that the first person, I really found hard to to stay engaged and focused with her because she was so quick running through her talking points that I was trying to run to catch up with her in my mind, like, what am I hearing? And so it was difficult to actually hone in on everything that she was saying, and everything that she was saying was important, clearly, to her organization and to the moment, but because she was so rapid in her delivery, it was tough for someone to be able to be on the receiving end of that and really hone in on the messages that she was trying to convey. Whereas the second person, the second spokesperson, what she was able to do was to be more deliberate and slow in her delivery and be able to really allow the audience to take in the message that she was trying to deliver, really be able to hone in on those couple of key points and take that in a way that you didn't get from the first person. So it's important in the context of delivery. It's really easy in the moment because you might be nervous, you don't know how much time you have in an interview situation like that, and you might want to try to get everything in that you possibly can, and so you want to speak as fast as you possibly can. That's actually detrimental to your end goal. So if you can only get in 2 of your 4 messages, get in 2 and pick those 2 that are most important. But your goal is, at the end of the day, to have the people who are watching that interview take something away. So if you've crammed all your messages in there, but the person didn't take anything away because it was too hard to actually concentrate on what you were saying, you didn't deliver at the end of the day on your actual end goal. So now let's go to crafting your message. And this first part is really about helping you to do something that's going to be key in this process when you're interviewing. It's called the soundbite. So a soundbite is really one that is memorable. It's a 3 to 10 second on average simple phrase or sentence that if someone takes away nothing else in your interview and they take away that soundbite, they learned something different, something that then may spark them to want to then go and look up more information about your organization, go and look up more information about the issue. So you want to make sure that you have at least one soundbite ready, and if possible, be able to have more than one ready to go. So we'll go through a couple of just quick examples of that. And this first one is interesting because this is Sheryl Sandberg, and when she was promoting her book, she chose to offer not just a soundbite, but actually a soundbite that was controversial commentary. And you know, if you're good enough to do that, then you do it. And she was able to do so, and do so in a way that actually got her a lot of press for this soundbite. You could see, if you were leading into the evening news, let's say, that soundbite could be the trailer that is the tease to the fact that that interview with her is coming up. But you also do not have to be controversial. You can be relatable as well. So for people on the Zoom who happen to have kids, you understand this the soundbite that cleaning a house is like brushing your teeth while eating Oreos, right? So making sure that whatever your soundbite is, that it's something that can be memorable by your audience at the end of the day. And so now we want to do a soundbite exercise with you. So we're going to give you just a few minutes to try to practice creating that 3 to 10 second soundbite. And it's important to note that these sound bites are going to come in handy later on in another exercise when we actually take you into the breakout rooms. We're going to give you a chance to practice those sound bites and be able to do that in an interview setting. So before we mark off time for you to start to do that, want to make sure to share with you what the issues are. We chose 4 different issues today to try to help make sure that when we get into the breakout rooms, we have an opportunity to have everybody be able to practice, around some 4 key components that are really big issues that are going on right now. So the first is census, then there's voting, then there's public charge with immigration, and lastly, Black Lives Matter. So give you 2 to 3 minutes here to be able to try to craft your own sound bites. I invite you to feel free, if you want to share, put them in the chat box so that other people can see them, can remark on them. And again, those will come in handy later on in this presentation. And while you're doing that, I'll share just a couple of other sound bites that are ones that that we just saw, and then one new one that actually pertains to the moment as well. So it is 4:23 by my watch, and we will come back at 4:25 to go into the next portion of the presentation. And if you've just joined us, please make sure that you are muting yourself. And also feel free to introduce yourself in the chat room. All right, great. I'm starting to see some sound bites come into the chat. This is great. Voting, transformation. Our nation's future is in your hands. Vote. The census is counting on you. These are great. Great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And please continue to keep sharing I'm going to turn over the presentation to my colleague, Mary, but please feel free to continue sharing. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Michelle. Next slide, please. So in this section, we're going to go over how to craft your message. This is going to be really important because whenever you're being interviewed, you want to be able to communicate your top line points that you want to get across. And when we're going through this, please keep in mind whatever issue area that you want to talk about so that we can practice your messaging development at the end. So an example of this when we're talking about immigration, immigration enforcement is drilling down to the point that immigration enforcement policies are separating and tearing apart families, and there are no longer enforcement priorities in this administration. So that's all you really need, just 1 to 3 key messages that you want to get across to your interviewer and to the news source. Next slide. An important framework to keep in mind for this is called VPSA. Some of you might be familiar with this. It's from the Opportunity Agenda and some other groups. So the V in VPSA is value, and we as mostly nonprofit organizations, we always want to lead by our values-based messaging because these are the values that are going to resonate with our audience and highlight the issues that are plaguing our society. And then the next thing we want to keep in mind is what is the problem that we're trying to address or tackle? What's the main issue that we want to talk about, and how does this problem threaten our value? S is solution. What is your organization or personal solutions to addressing these issues? And this will provide more clarity and make it clear who is the person in power that we're trying to tackle here, or who is the authority figure or what have you that we can address to in the solution. And finally, A for action. What is a tangible thing that people can do to address this problem? What's the next step? Or is it calling a representative, or what can the community do to mobilize and address the problem? Next slide. And reminders for preparing for your interview is, what do you want your audience to take away from what you're saying? And then you want to bookend the conversation. Tell them exactly what you want to get across at the beginning and tell them at the end. Oftentimes, when you're talking to someone in broadcast or perhaps being interviewed for an online piece or publication, they're not going to write down or pull out every single word that you're saying. They're going to extrapolate the most important information. So that's why you want to be able to use your bridging phrases and your sound bites to get the message across. Thank you. And other things to keep in mind when you are developing your message is to come up with a few facts that support your message, but you don't want to get too wonky with your data as well. You're not writing a report or publishing a report, so you can express your data in very simple terms, saying things like 2 out of 3, or about half, or 50%. You don't want to overcomplicate things for your audience, is the main point. Next slide. So that was a little bit quick, but now think about the issue that you want to talk about and what is your VPSA, value, problem, solution, and action. and come up with about 1 to 3 talking points about your main issue. And maybe we can go back to the BPSA slide so that folks can reference it. And if you have any questions about that, feel free to either unmute yourself and speak up or type it in the chat box. And we'll get back together at 4:36, so 36 after the hour. Okay, we'll give it just one more minute. Feel free to raise your hand if you would like to share your top messages. Okay, does anyone want to share what they came up with?
I'll share. I'll be the guinea pig and kind of lighten the mood a little bit. This is Honorary Thompson with AAJC. And so I guess this relates to the message development. Is that right, Mary? In terms of answering the questions with the VPSA?
Yeah, so what are the top messages if you were being interviewed about your issue area that you would want to get across to someone?
Sure, absolutely. So, and I'm doing this off of the top of my head. I didn't write anything down. So what are our shared values as a society and community? So for my issue area, which is technology and telecommunications, shared values would be equity, fairness, and justice in the technology space, and what that means to our organization. And it means that communities of color, Asian Americans, we deserve a seat at the table. We're concerned about decreasing the digital divide. We're concerned about broadband adoption, broadband development. But our shared values as a society and community is certainly across equality, fairness, and justice for all, particularly in the technology space. So, and then the problem, what is the issue we are facing right now? How does it threaten our values? So one issue that we are facing as it relates again to my issue area is certainly misinformation and disinformation. We are, of course, concerned also about privacy, facial recognition technology, and its impact on our communities, the AAPI communities. And so I will stop there to open it up in case anyone else wants to jump in.
Thanks, Henri.
Sure.
And Cynthia, I believe you wanted to share what you came up with.
Yes, hi, thanks so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the 3 key messages I want to get across are: 1, to my friends on the left who are protesting in the streets but who have not gotten behind the police reform efforts. Protest alone is not sufficient. We need laws to hold police accountable. 2nd, it's important to focus on the reasonableness of police action, as well as the reasonableness of the police officer's belief. And 3, having de-escalation in the law is better than having it in police training manuals and police policy, because a violation of a police policy is not enforceable in a court of law. And then I did the VPSA. Do you want me to share that?
Sure, if you can share some highlights from it, that'd be great.
Sure. Okay, so we value fairness and equal treatment. The problem is police using deadly force in ways that don't seem fair or just. The solution is to pass laws that restrict police use of deadly force, like a legislation that I've proposed in a 2018 law review article. And action, sign my petition urging the DC Council to make permanent the use of deadly force legislation that it passed in June, but that is just temporary, not permanent. Email, call your DC Council members and share the DC Council's use of deadly force provisions with other legislators in other states.
Great, thanks for sharing, Cynthia. I think you've really put together what sounds like a full platform and messaging and action items, so that was great. And I see that Evelyn, did you want to read out what you typed in the chat?
Oh, thank you. I didn't get it in the right format, but the value is that our World War II veterans fought, died, and sacrificed for all of us. The problem is, even though the Congressional Gold Medal has been awarded and the legislation signed, only 3,000 of the 20,000 Chinese American veterans have registered. The solution is for them to go to the website and register your loved ones so that they will be presented with a Congressional Gold Medal. and the action, and the action is for them to pay attention and participate in the ceremonies and record and document their veterans' sacrifice so that it's part of their family history. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for sharing and for working on that. And last volunteer, Susanna, do you also want to read your VPSA and messaging out loud?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm on the school board, so looking at this very, very, real time. But in our community, which is the San Francisco Bay Area, in our school district, of course, and community, I think it's with all, right, school community and stuff, we value, the message is, the value is that we value, of course, education. The problem, of course, that we're finding out in-person school, right, is best, but most everyone has to go on, depending on where you are, I think, in the country. In our area, most of our schools have gone online or going online, remote distance learning. And we're finding out, of course, that, in-person learning is the best. But of course, due to the pandemic, it have to go online, and that, of course, the pandemic threatens the physical health, but then the online, of course, is unfortunately giving some of our students and us, right, some of the mental health issues. So that's the problem. Solution is because there are many different feelings and opinions around this area. We really do need to work together, understand that education and health are really linked together. And in action, I think the easiest and most tangible action right now is that everyone in our community needs to, do their part to mitigate the COVID virus, like, washing hands, wearing masks, don't gather, everything public health has been asking us to do, so that we can easily go back in person school sooner rather than having to wait till maybe a vaccine or something. So, and we might have to do that, but anyway, that's my.
Thanks, Susanna, for sharing a very timely issue as we are in back to school season. I think for the action part, I think it's good, and also think about who you really want to target with the action, so that what is the thing that the community can mobilize around. Like, do they not want to have the hybrid option, for instance? So is there a letter that you can write or sign on to the superintendent or something like that? And Cynthia asked for more suggestions. I think it's always important to just, for as long as you're doing the work, go back and reflect on what your messages are. Are they current with what's going on now? Is there a way you can tighten it even more? And always think back to your audience and who you're talking to simplify your message. And with that, I will turn it over to Michael and Danny. So thank you so much for participating.
Thanks so much, Mary, and Michelle as well for leading the first part of this. I'm going to talk a little bit about preparing for the interview, how to control the interview. So let's say, your organization covers a certain topic and it's big in the news, and so you get a reporter reaches out and says, hey, I'd like to interview you for a story on this particular issue. Or, you have a really great communications point person on your organization, and they've been pitching reporters and trying to get them to get interest in your organization. So now comes, the time for the action. People, someone wants to listen, wants to hear from you, and so they're going to interview you. So next slide. Preparing for the interview. First thing you want to ask yourself is, what's the format? Are you the only person being interviewed? Is it one-on-one between you and the reporter? Are there other people being interviewed, and are they being interviewed at the same time or separately? And it's important also for you to know who those people are. Are their perspectives different from yours? Is it, if their perspectives are covering certain areas, is it important for you to think about like, well, I need to cover this section because I think it's really important for the audience to know this. Secondly, imagine your audience. And by that, I mean, literally picture the person that you are trying to reach. Is the news outlet a podcast that younger Latinos tend to listen to? Or is it a website that is super popular on the mom blogosphere? Do your research and really figure out what their audience looks like, and then think about who within that audience you want to talk to, you want to speak to. It doesn't have to be all of their audience. It can just be the people that you specifically are trying to target and trying to get them to take action on. Next slide, please. In addition to, kind of getting background about the reporter, the outlet, the audience, things to think about when you are going to do an interview is posture and eye contact. If you are standing, make sure that you have, good posture and that you're not slouching. If you're sitting, actually, and this is actually a super common thing for most people, is that they'll tend to slouch in their chair, and it doesn't exactly exude confidence. You have to realize that nonverbal cues are super important when you're on video and communicating confidence. And so you want to make sure that you are exuding that that vision, that confidence to your audience. For TV news, they really like this thing called the off-camera angle, where, and I'll actually, Michelle, if you don't mind stopping the share screen so that everyone can see my video screen. And I'll do a couple of things on this right now. But TV news really likes to do the off-camera angle, where you're talking to either an actual reporter or an imaginary reporter. And so when you are doing an in-person interview, you want to make sure that you're looking at the reporter or slightly off camera rather than looking directly at the camera. They tend to not like you looking at the camera for news segments. Sorry, I'm taking a look at the Mary's comments on the G chat. Looking good on video chat. So obviously recently, because of COVID-19, most on-camera interviews are actually via video chat. So there's a couple of other things to keep in mind for that. First of all, your backgrounds, you want to pick your background carefully. You want it to be somewhat of an office environment if possible, or at least pretend to look like an office environment. You don't want to have a plain white wall, and you also don't want to have it, you don't want a window behind you that has light coming through it, because either a white wall or a window with light coming through it are going to create such a contrast for the lighting that they're not really going to be able to see your face. So I'm going to do a couple of examples of different types of lighting. So bear with me as I move my camera. So my laptop, I mean. So one of the very lucky things that I got recently was a laptop stand. And so that helps me keep my video at eye level. What you don't want is you don't want to have nostril vision, which is where you see these interviews on TV, where basically you can see almost someone's nostrils during the interview. You want to avoid that as much. The last thing we'll talk about in terms of video chat is lighting. As you'll see in this example, I have a window that's open and there's lighting behind me, and that is just not only super distracting, but it just doesn't help like the rest of the lighting in the room. And in addition to that, and apologies, there's some roof work right now happening in my house, so there might be some noise. But you might also notice that there's lighting on the right side of my face, and not so much lighting on the left side of my face. So one of the things that you do want to do whenever you're setting yourself up on your computer for a media interview is that you want to try to do it near a window where you have natural light, and where that natural light is coming directly towards you. So you want that light to come in so that it basically floods the entire area, and the lighting is a little bit easier and you know, softer on your face. So we can go back to screen share, Michelle, if possible, and I'll kind of run through the rest of my slides before passing it on to my colleague, Michael. So I actually got a couple of questions. We got a couple of questions before we started the webinar. This is specifically about video chat. So the first question is, how do you use your computer as a teleprompter so you can speak directly to the camera while reading your notes and not having to look down or away from the camera to read one's notes? I have my laptop webcam open and my PC behind it. It's obvious that I'm reading my notes on my PC because my eyes are looking up. So number one, try not to depend too much on your notes, first of all, so that you're not looking at them too often. Your notes should really have your top 3 messages so that you kind of glance at them quickly and then talk naturally. One of the things you don't want to do is read from talking points when you're doing an interview, because it's really obvious to the reporter and to your audience that you're reading and that you're not speaking authentically. So that's number one. Number two, like one of the things that I'm currently doing right now is that I am looking at my notes on the same screen as I'm looking at the Zoom meeting. So you can have them side to side so that you're kind of looking a little bit off center. But again, try to look as much as possible when you're on video chat. Try looking at the camera so that your eye contact is with the viewer and the audience. The second question that I got was related to virtual backgrounds, which is how do you get rid of the green halo that appears whenever you have a virtual background? So this is something that actually a lot of people use because they're in home environments that are not really useful for Zoom meetings, and so they use virtual backgrounds to basically cover everything that's going on behind them. I unfortunately have an old computer, so my old computer does not have capacity to do virtual backgrounds very well. It kind of looks a little choppy and pixelated. So one of the things with virtual backgrounds is if you do have a green screen and you are using a green screen for your virtual background, you want to be careful about putting too much lighting. Actually, you want to be careful about, make sure your lighting is a little dim and not too strong, because that lighting will in of itself cause the halo around you because it's reflecting off the green thing. So sorry, Michelle, to make you jump around. Next slide. So when speaking, and again, apologies for all the noise. I might have to switch around to a different room in a little bit when I get a break from my colleague, Michael. So when speaking, remember that more than likely you are a stranger to the audience. They don't know who you are, and they don't trust you yet. So one of the first things that you want to do during the interview is to try to say something that connects you to that audience. So you might want to say something like, as a resident of this community, so say whatever community you're in. I currently live in Sylmar, California. So I'll say, as a resident of Sylmar, California, or if you want to talk specifically about a certain issue, like I am very worried about, our voting rights. I want to make sure that I have, guarantee my vote to my right to a ballot, to a mail-in ballot. Shout out to Sylmar over there. But whatever you say, it's got to be something that connects you to the audience, because what you're trying to do is you're creating an opening for trust. So you want to create that opening where they trust you somewhat, and then use that opportunity to persuade them. So first connect and then persuade. Stories versus stats. It's definitely more compelling to use a story. I know we all really like using statistics for a lot of our work, where a lot of us are very wonky, but it's in fact more persuasive to tell a real life story. So if you are going to use a stat, tell that stat and then have a story that is set up to kind of validate that statistic. So you might say, there are so many, there's a percentage of this of people who don't have access to the ballot. but then you tell a story about a person, you know, so-and-so's aunt who lives in Florida needs help, you know, getting that ballot to the right place. So you want to tell that kind of stories so that people can connect with it. And then finally, keep it simple. Don't overwhelm your audience with information. They can only really your audience can only really retain a few pieces of information from you at a time. So whatever you are telling them, make sure that it counts. Next slide. Repeat your message over and over again. You know, you might think that you sound like a robot, but more often than not, it's super effective. I don't know if anyone here was watching the DNC last week, but every single person said text vote or text more or text this to 30330. And like that is a message that kind of resonated throughout the week. And I remembered it. You know, I remember the number now, even though I'm not involved in any way with the campaign, but it's a super effective way. So don't be afraid of repeating the message at least once, and try to make sure that you close with it. So that's the last thing that your audience remembers. And then, you know, in terms of the soundbite exercise we did previously, think about, as you're answering these questions, think about where it makes sense to plant one of the sound bites that you worked on. So figure out where it makes sense and kind of insert it. And, you know, some of it is going to be a little bit of, you know, trial and error, but really give yourself the opportunity to give that a shot. And then finally, which is something I should probably take advantage of, is take a breath, a slight pause before responding to questions. Most of us get nervous when we're speaking, and when we get nervous, we speak a little faster. So just try to remember that you want to speak slower. The slower you speak, the more likely the people that you are talking to will understand you. So for the next slide, I'm going to bring in my colleague, Michael Tora, to talk about bridging.
Thanks, Danny, and hello, everyone. So, you know, sometimes the reporter is going to ask you the perfect question, you know, like the type of question that just tees you up very nicely to share your view, share your expertise in all its glory, and get your message across crisply. But it's actually really rare. Most often, the reporter's question is not going to be that perfect. You might get kind of a softball open question, but many times you're going to get a question that might be sort of tangential. It might come through a frame that's somewhat problematic, right? Contradictory to what you're trying to achieve and communicate. They might ask a leading question that sort of will lure you down a rabbit hole where you could end up, you know, burning up all of your interview time talking about that sort of side issue or that other angle, and then you never get your own proactive message across. So this is where the bridging tactic comes in, and this is what I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about. It's a pretty simple concept. You're probably familiar with the term kind of pivot. This is somewhat similar. We prefer to talk about bridging because it's really about bringing someone across kind of from where the reporter's question is to your message and to where you want to take them and be. So in bridging, really, we start with the reporter's question. You provide a bridging statement that acknowledges the question, kind of addresses it succinctly, and then segues smoothly to what is your proactive message, right? So, and there's a few ways. Next slide, please. So there's a few ways to help kind of make this shift feel less abrupt, right? And you'll see on this slide a list, certainly not an exhaustive list, of the types of phrases that a lot of seasoned interviewees like to use, right? To really kind of cushion that transition from the reporter's question to their proactive messaging point. And the great thing about these phrases is they also serve as kind of like a signal to the audience that that you're about to give the core message. It's like waving a flag to say, listen to what I'm about to say because this is the part that really matters, right? So it's really helpful in that regard as well. So why don't we just look at an example to see what this looks like in an actual interview. So here we have a reporter on the topic of the census. So one of the 4 topics that we'll be doing during our practices, our interview practices later on, and that some of you have already begun to think about in the previous exercises. So here we're going to assume that the interviewee's message point is really about the need to participate in the census and get counted because of all the benefits that has for the community, right? Like that's the message you want to get across. But the reporter comes to you with this question: what do you say to people who are concerned about the privacy of their information if they fill out the census form? So here's a potential response by an interviewee. Well, don't be worried. Under federal law, the Census Bureau is required to protect the confidentiality of individual responses, and that protection should encourage you to fill out the census. And this is important because if everyone isn't counted, communities won't get the investments in schools, healthcare, transportation, and affordable housing that they deserve. By completing your census form, you're doing your part to invest in the future of your family and your own community. So let's go to the next slide just to see, kind of dissect this a little bit. You'll just see with the color coding, right? In blue, which is not the majority of the response, is really addressing the reporter's question kind of quickly. And then there's that key kind of transition phrase that also is flagging the important piece, right? And this is important because, and then in green you see the proactive message. And again, I just want to stress how important it is to sort of keep that sort of response to the reporter's question as succinct as possible. And this can be tough. It takes a lot of self-discipline because if you've been working on this issue and you've been reading all the arguments and counter arguments behind different aspects of the census, right, you could potentially have a lot to say. You could probably talk for quite a bit of time about how well protected the census data is. But you got to remember, you're going to have limited time in the interview. So you really want to kind of keep that as concise as possible so that you can get on to your proactive message. Now let me turn back to Danny. He's going to walk us through a few more things, though, that you need to look out for in terms of ways that you can get tripped up by journalists. And then I'm going to come back with another bridging example after that. So back to you, Danny.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, so a few things just to keep in mind, tricks that reporters tend to do. Reporters sometimes come in with an agenda, and usually that agenda is not the same as yours. So don't let them knock you off your key messages. Even if they keep asking the same question that you have already answered and they're trying to get a specific question from you, don't feel compelled to change your answer. Stick to the points that you've decided are important because that's your central message, and you want to make sure that the audience stays with that. Don't be afraid of silence. If you've answered the question, feel free to stop. You don't have to keep talking. People sometimes get themselves in trouble with their answers because they just kind of keep going and going and going, and eventually that last final thing that you said is what the reporter actually latches onto and does a follow-up on, rather than your very first point of your answer. Next slide. Don't let the reporter get under your skin. Even if they're being a jerk, remember to stay positive. Remember that video is forever, and so any kind of interview that happens is going to potentially might be reported on. So you don't want the headline of that interview to be advocate goes off on reporter or advocate gets angry at reporter. You want that headline to be advocate stays cool and pushes their key message during tense interview. So make sure that you don't get upset at the reporter. And finally on this, on tricks of the trade, don't speculate. Reporters sometimes ask hypothetical questions. It's okay to say that you don't know or you're not sure, and then pivot to one of your key messages. And Michael will actually talk a little bit about that a few slides later. But finally, on the next slide, responding to questions under pressure. A few things to keep in mind when you're under pressure. If you don't understand the question, ask for clarification of the question. Obviously, try to listen in fully while the reporter is speaking. A lot of us are starting to prepare our answers as the reporter is talking, so make sure you don't distract yourself with your own thoughts as you're doing the interview. If you didn't hear the interview, if you didn't hear the question, if you didn't understand it, buy yourself time, ask them to repeat the question, ask them for clarification. And, after they ask the question, don't give too much information, keep it simple, but make sure that you still answered, at least to the extent that you want to, that specific question. And like I previously said, it's okay to say some form of, you don't have to say, I don't know, but you can say some form like, let me get back to you. Let me check my stats on that one. I want to be sure that I'm 100% correct on this. It's okay to buy yourself time in that form rather than answering the question directly if you don't have the answer. And then finally, do not lie. Video is forever. And so if you are lying, eventually someone is going to point out the lie and you just don't want that to happen.
Thanks, Danny. I'll keep this one brief because I know time is ticking and I want to make sure that we get to our practice interviews here. But just one more question or one more example on bridging. And here we have another leading question on the question of voting. Of course, about voter fraud. Very tempting, of course, to be able to talk about all the ways in which voter fraud isn't really a real issue. But what you see in this case, assuming that the interviewee really wants to get the message across that we need to have multiple voting options for people to ensure that they are indeed able to vote and that their vote is counted. So here you have a reporter asking about, with the increased use of mail-in voting, isn't there increased risk of voter fraud in this year's election? And the interviewee quickly dispenses with that by just saying, I'm glad you asked me that. The truth is that research shows that mail-in voter fraud is exceedingly rare. The real issue is, see, there's that kind of flagging phrase. The real issue is that between COVID-19 and voter suppression tactics, there's a much greater risk of eligible voters being unable to cast their ballots unless we increase their voting options, including more polling places and mail-in voting. So I think we should go ahead and get moving towards our practice here. So of course, for anyone who's maybe a little bit nervous, I know we've got a mix of people who've conducted a lot of interviews and others maybe who are newer to this. So let me just say, for those who maybe are a bit newer to it and might be a little bit nervous, whether for this practice or for the real thing, just remember that you're starting from a place of strength, right? You know your subject matter better than the reporter who's going to be asking you about it. And think about it. The work of figuring out the subject matter takes years. What Michelle and Mary and Bernie on the previous webinar and Danny and I now on this one have been doing is trying to just make sure that you've got kind of the tips and tools to be able to ensure that you're able to communicate what you know in the most effective way so you can move your audience to do what you want them to do. And in a way, that's kind of the easier part. So you've already mastered the hardest part, right? So just keep that in mind. All right, so we're going to jump now to do some practice interviews. We're going to break up into 4 groups here through kind of the magic of Zoom. And as Michelle had said in the beginning, we're going to have 4 topics, right? So we're going to have census, voting, public charge, and Black Lives Matter. And in each of the breakout sessions, if we can just have someone volunteer to be sort of the interviewee, right? And then one of the 4 of us will be playing the interviewer. Remember, we are role playing here, so we might be, asking you some questions that come from a framework that's maybe a bit problematic, right? We're not trying to be sort of the easy interviewers here all the time. We might start with some easy questions and then work our way up to kind of make it a little bit challenging for you, right? And exercise some of that muscle that we've taught you to have for these interviews. So with that, let's start the splitting up into group sections. Once we're in each group, obviously feel free to ask more questions, and we'll do little evaluations after each mock interview within our groups.